Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Paideia Institute online lecture series. Um, it's my pleasure today to welcome Professor John Finamore, with whom we'll be having a discussion about Neoplatonism, Iamblichus, and the Ascent Ritual. John Finamore is Emeritus Professor of Classics at the University of Iowa. He is the co-author, along with Dirk Baltzy and Gray Miles of Proclus, Commentary on Plato's Republic, Volumes 1 and 2, 2018-2022, and editor of the International Journal of the Platonic Tradition. So Neoplatonism is a philosophy which emerged in the 3rd century AD, most notably through the writings of Plotinus, a philosopher and mystic from Roman Egypt. Some of the major tenets of the philosophy include the idea of the one, and the concept of the soul's ascent. And we'll be talking today about those topics, as well as one of the major debates in Neoplatonic philosophy involving the need for Theurgy in such an ascent. Yeah. John, can you confirm this description of Neoplatonism?
I think you've got that's not bad at all. Good job.
Can you tell us a little bit about the philosophical scene, practically speaking? Where were the Neoplatonists? How pervasive was the philosophy during the time period? What were some of the major competing schools?
Yes, I can do that. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me here. This is a pleasure. It's nice to see so many people obviously eager to hear about Platonism. This is a good thing. So I hope I don't disappoint you. We talked about Plotinus being the start of this, but let me start before that. You really have to start with Plato back in the 4th century BCE. Plato set up an amazing philosophy that led to many, many questions. So people started writing about him on and off through the whole period between his lifetime and Plotinus in the 3rd century CE. What started happening around the 1st century BCE to 1st century CE is that Platonism started coming to its own as a period we call Middle Platonism, because we're really inventive in philosophy with names. So what happened here was they started looking at Plato, not just the texts themselves and what Plato was saying, but how to basically do philosophy while you're reading Plato. Bring Plato into the modern era, their contemporary era, and do something with it. So things started happening with religion, pagan religion, and Platonism that were new, looking at Egyptian religion and tying that into the Platonic tradition, complaining about materialist philosophies like Stoicism and Epicureanism, worrying about what Aristotle got right and what Aristotle got wrong. All that is in the mixing bowl when you get to Plotinus. And Plotinus's big change here, why we call it Neoplatonism, which, by the way, was a term 18th century German, and it was pejorative. New Platonism wasn't as good as old Platonism, but we still use it even though we don't think that anymore. So Plotinus started looking at it, and he added a structure for the whole universe that was sort of an embryo in the Middle Platonic period, but grew in the Neoplatonic period. And now you've got a universe that has a complete unity as its source, the one, they called it, where everything was one and simple, and there was no one and the other, just simple unicity. Under that, you start getting some Aristotelianism, and we have the intellect in place. An intellect is a dyad. Instead of being all one, it's thinker separated from its thought. So you got two involved. Thought, thinking. If you know Aristotle's De Anima, you know how crazy this can get. If you don't worry about it. Third in line comes the soul. This is where we are, more or less, but the soul has two phases to it. There's the soul that's above the material world, the eternal soul that we all know, and that has a relationship to the intellect. But looking downwards, it also has, in the fourth sphere, the physics or nature, it has a relationship with the body and materialism, and that gets it into the sphere of time and thinking, from place to place to place, from thought to thought to thought. So whereas in the intellect, the thinker and the thought become almost one, and there's no time. It all happens in eternity, and it's like you know it all as a mosaic, if you'd like. Down here, we got it rougher. We have to go one at a time, think through. Now, from Plotinus to Porphyry, his student, to Iamblichus, who some think was Porphyry's student and others don't. We only have one indication that he was, and it's doubtful. Then moving through a whole Neoplatonic tradition up until Proclus and Damascius and people like that, they took this basic form, right, that came from Plotinus. Iamblichus changed it dramatically, bringing in religion to it in a way that it wasn't involved before, pagan religion, of course. And then the rest of them developed Iamblichian Neoplatonism, making little changes here and there, but keeping the system pretty static. So that's sort of an overview of how we got to Neoplatonism. Megan, is that all right?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess quick question off of what you just said. So you're saying the majority of Neoplatonic thought is Iamblichian Neoplatonism. So there would have been like a small time period of Plotinus's system that then was completely switched over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Plotinus, remember his student Porphyry sort of adapted it too, made some changes. He was more open to ritual, religious ritual and magic and that kind of thing, but still kept philosophy as the primary goal to make you get back to the one, which is your plan. You want to get back there. Iamblichus said, no, 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 you can't do it that way. You can be the greatest philosopher in the world. You can know all about Plato. You can do that kind of philosophy. But you also have to have this religious realm to it, which is part of that theurgic process we'll talk about later, that brings your soul out of your body and up to the gods again. So you couldn't just do it by philosophy alone. So for Plotinus, you could like be sitting in your basement and doing a individual ritual of your own and get in contact with the one, kind of like modern Indian philosophy in some ways. And with the Iamblichus, you could no longer do that. You had to have the ritual to get yourself out of your body.
Thank you. I guess that brings me to my next question for you about Iamblichus's bringing religious aspects to the philosophical tradition. So he brings in the Theurgic practices and pagan ritual magic. But he also, I'm wondering what you have to say about the move from the one to the Trinitarian one in Iamblichus's philosophy, as well as also his introduction of the concept of the damaged soul.
Mm-hmm. Let me start by saying that the Platonists love triads, and you'll see it throughout the Neoplatonic systems that we study. So if you have an intellect, the intellect's going to have three aspects to it. So there's going to be intellect 1, 2, and 3. So that's natural to the process. Christianity, as it developed, glommed onto Platonism as well. It was the primary philosophy of the time period once you get to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century CE. So they were going to use it as well. So their trinity, in a way, can be seen as their triad. And they had other triads too, depending on which religious thinker you're reading. And you can even see it in the medieval period. So this idea of threes keeps coming back. And I think that was a natural progression. Theirs is different, right? It's not anything like you're going to find in the pagan. But yes, they've also borrowed from the pagans other triads that were much more close to the pagan tradition than they were to the Christian, and adapted them and used them that way. What was the second half of your question? I'm sorry, there was two parts.
The second half is about the introduction of the concept of the damaged soul.
Oh, the soul's always damaged. This is just the way we are. It's really hard to, we're talking about the ascent ritual. Let me do the descent so you understand why it's so difficult. We are not originally a material universe being. We're not like that. Our natural place is up above, at least with the intellect, perhaps with the one itself. So you can imagine yourself through all eternity, right, being there. Why in the world would you leave that to come down to Iowa City? What would be the point of that? So Plotinus has like a chapter that begins, I came back and I kind of wonder why I ever came down here. Why did I do that? And he has to try to explain that. And then you get into the different problems with that. Like, is with something bad we did that got us down here? Then you got to explain how you can do something bad on the level of intellect, which is really hard to do. Or is it, and this was more what I think Plato's saying in the Timaeus, is it rather something in the nature of the soul? This is something we have to do. This is part of the process. We have to come down. We have to help make the universe, make the material world better, and then use that as we glide back up to the one again to spend more time. If you think of Plato's cave story in the Republic, where philosophers go up from the cave. Remember, they're tied down in the cave, and all they can see is shadows, and they don't really know true reality. And one of them is allowed to leave, and he goes out into the light. And at first, he doesn't want to go, and he fights against it, but eventually climbs up, and eventually can look at trees and this sort of thing. So that's a story about this is how we get to know the forms, which are the bright lights in the sky that at first seem too bright and we can't understand, but later we come to know, and that gives us knowledge of things. So once we do that, then we have to descend to the cave again, Plato says. It's part of our duty to go back and help the ones that haven't been freed from their bonds to do that. And that's more the Neoplatonic way, and Iamblichus, Proclus, those guys, of looking at the ascent ritual and the reason for the ascent in the first place. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you. So I guess we can get into, now that we've talked about the descent of the soul, how exactly do we do this ascent ritual? So I have a few questions. I guess the first one is, in your paper you write, Iamblichus believes that each human soul follows in the train of a single god. So how would we know which god is ours?
I have to laugh at this one. That's such a good question, and we don't have an answer, of course. But let me take you back to Plato's. Let me take you back to Plato's Phaedrus to get you started on it. Plato and the Phaedrus has this story of us following in the trail of the gods. The gods move around the universe. It looks like he's talking about the planets because he's talking about the basic names of gods that match planets. Okay, and we follow in that path somehow or another, and we belong to that god. And that's why some of us are jovial because we follow Jupiter, why some of us are Saturnine because we follow Saturn, that kind of thing. So it sounds like, kind of horoscopes and things like that. The Neoplatonists didn't think that was what was going on. For one thing, Plato has the gods go up to the top of the universe. Oh, I should do that too. Back up one second. The cosmos is made up of planetary circles. The outermost circle is the sphere of the fixed stars. Imagine it as a three-dimensional globe surrounding everything, and the stars are embedded in it. That whole thing moves as a whole, right? And that's why the stars come and go and that kind of thing, but we're pretty constant also. Then below that, each of the planets has a place to be, and it moves in its own path. And then we're at the center in the earth. Now, in the Plato myth in the Phaedrus, the gods ascend with their horses and chariots, because that's the way he pictures them, and they park their souls on the top of that sphere that's the stars. And then if we follow with them, we are then on that sphere. And as the sphere moves, we can see outside the universe, right, in 360 degrees over a year's time or 100 years' time or whatever it is. What's outside of the universe are the Platonic forms, the abstract entities that we in the material world and things in the material world try to imitate. So a glass of water, right, is imitating what water should be like, the essence of water, to the best of its ability in a material substance. Whereas the form of water, if there is a form of water, the form of water wouldn't be that at all. It would have no materiality to it. It would have no shape. It would just be a kind of ultimate description of some sort. All right. So the Neoplatonists looked at this and said, well, there can't be the planets because they can't go up to the top of the universe and park their chariots there. That would wreak havoc with the universe. It wouldn't work, right? So they said that can't be it. So it must be a higher order of gods that we're talking about, and we're each joined to one. Now, how does that happen? Plato's Timaeus. In the Timaeus, we learned that there's one God that creates everything. He doesn't create it out of nothing. He puts it in order. Matter always existed. It's permanent and eternal. But he put it into the best possible system. And then he took souls and created them himself and put those souls each into a star in this fixed star range. So our souls originally were there, if you will. And then from there, it descends to one of the planets. With me? So that's how we get attached to one of the planets. So if you say, how do I know which one I'm attached to? I said, you got to find that out. You got to find the right person, the philosopher that can tell you. But you know that you originally were stardust and golden, right? When you're in the stardust range. And then you come down and take on certain overtones from the god that's the planet. And that's your guiding god in all cases. And that guiding god has a special relationship with the intelligible gods, which are above that have no material body. And that's what was, okay. So that combines Phaedrus, the higher gods, with the Timaeus, the lower gods, finally with us, not the Phaedrus, the Timaeus, and finally with us. Everything is a system of ups and downs. Think of it that way.
So is that something that the Theurgist might help you figure out if, or how?
Nobody better than a Theurgist. Absolutely. Theurgy is the name of the ritual that was probably borrowed from Middle Platonic times in Syria, where there was a group of people that did this sort of thing and created a whole lot of what we call the Chaldean oracles that were written in verse that tell you about the gods. Interesting sub-story about that. They got that through communing with, while the two priests were on earth, a father-son combination, both named Julian. They got that from contacting the soul of Plato, who gave them that story. All right, so Theurgy develops out of that. It's a localized religious custom. Iamblichus is from the same area, and he makes it wider, right? So now we have Theurgy that's a practice that has some rules to it, and Iamblichus can lay these rules out for us, and then we can learn more about it. So a Theurgist is somebody that has studied under Iamblichus in his school in Syria, has learned learned all about Plato and Platonism from the texts, has learned how to interpret them, but has also learned the religious philosophy that's necessary to be a priest. So that person knows in a way that you or I would not what the realm of, excuse me, which of the gods in the realm above is our God, and how to do the ritual to get your body separated, excuse me, to get your soul separated from your body and ascend again. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So
I'm trying to get the impact of the idea that everything that Plato does, everything that Iamblichus does and these Neoplatonists do, look back to Plato, but then also add some religious overtones to it to change the philosophy. Sorry, go ahead.
thank you. So I guess, yeah, talking about now that we know how to figure out which god we're trying to commune with, can we talk about exactly how the ritual happens? So you talk about divine illumination, which divine illumination seems common enough in different theological, philosophical traditions. But the way that the vehicle works, seems particular to this school. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, this will take some doing too. So if you got a cup of coffee next to you, you can use it. All right, let's see where to start. Let's start with Plato's Symposium. We haven't talked about that yet. It's one of my favorite dialogues. It's a set of speeches that different people give at a drinking party, where they promise not to get drunk, but just to to praise the god Eros, the god of love. And in the end, toward the end of that, because the end of that is even funnier, but toward the end of it, Socrates gives his speech about what Eros is. And it turns out that Eros is not some wonderful god, which all the other speakers thought he was, but rather was a demon, or daimon in Greek. And this is sort of an intermediary that goes between human beings and gods because, and this is like a throwaway line, I think, in Plato, but made Platonic philosophy possible in a way that never would have been otherwise. He writes, the gods do not descend to us. So we have to have these intermediaries that can bring the messages of the gods down to us and can bring our prayers and things up to them. The Neoplatonists ran with this. Okay, the gods can't come down here. We need intermediate beings between to take care of us. And they developed a whole slew of intermediary beings. You've got angels, you've got daimons, you've got heroes, you've got purified souls, and then you've got us. And they added a few more around the edges every once in a while too. There could be archangels and angels. Right? So we've got all that system between the gods that can't descend to us and us. And the gods that can't descend to us are all the gods, including the planetary ones, obviously. Because if the moon came down to us, we'd be in big trouble. Now, with all that set up, all these intermediaries can take a role in the theurgy that we're talking about. The theurgy is basically an ascent ritual. We don't know much about it. Nobody wrote down and said, this is what we do. We got to take a piece from here and a piece from there and try the best we can to figure it out. There's this marvelous passage. Oh, it's in Proclus somewhere, and I'm forgetting which work of his it's in right now. Might be the Platonic theology. It might even be the Republic commentary, which I should know better than I do, right? Okay, so in that one, he has a ritual where a human being is buried in the earth up to his head, so only his head is visible. And the priest does some sort of thing, some sort of ritual that brings the soul that's in the head of the body. We know that from Plato's Timaeus, so it's got a philosophical background. Brings the soul out of it and sort of makes it rise up to join the others. Now, we got a problem. When we're in a human being shape as we are right now, everything's material, and we're material. When we get up to the planetary gods, they are quasi-material. From Aristotle onwards, actually, if you take something Plato might have said in the Epinomis, which is probably not by him, but the Neoplatonists would have thought it was. You can think that all the planets are made of a fifth substance, not air, fire, earth, and water, but ether, what we call ether. So there's an ethereal realm where the planets are moving, and they've got ethereal bodies. So how do we get from our material body to their ethereal body? So that's got to be our first stop, right, to visit with the lower gods, the planetary gods, before we can get in contact with the higher gods and the intellect and all that. Now, there was a really handy thing that they thought they discovered in some of Plato's writings and in some of Aristotle's writings about a pneumatic vehicle. And they use the word, it's just a word for like a cart, a vehicle that you'd ride in. But that our soul, in order to get from outside the solar system, or the earthly system in their case, the geocentric system, down to here, it has to have an ethereal body to do that. So the ethereal body at first, it does a lot of other things too, but at first is a vehicle. It carries you from the higher realm to the lower one. And in the theurgy, in the theurgical rite, will then carry you out of your body to the planetary god. It's made entirely of ether. It's subsumed in us in some way or another. And the rational soul is subsumed in it as well. We also have an irrational soul that's subsumed into it, and maybe a thumic soul, spirited soul that's like that too. All right, so you've got all those things in place now. So whatever the ritual is, this guy that's buried up to his head, in one case, in Proclus, the soul leaves the body in the vehicle. Okay, vehicle is spherical, and you can see it. Iamblichus, in a book of his we call the De Mysteries, which he called basically an answer to Porphyry, the Neoplatonic philosopher that existed just before him, who may or may not have been his teacher. And he's complaining to Porphyry right and left in this. It's a blow by blow thing. Porphyry, you said this, you idiot. And he goes on to explain why he's wrong. In the middle, in third book, I think of that book, that treatise, he talks about the rite a little bit. And he talks about it as if there's a group of people around watching it take place. So you've got a theurgist, you've got a victim of some sort whose soul's going to be separated from his body, and you've got a crowd around. Some of them might be Iamblichus's students, some of them might be people from the local area that are priests or something else, or might be a regular community. And what do they see? And he describes, you can sometimes see a light shining. And what that is, he tells us, is the vehicle of the soul leaving the body and traveling upwards to the gods. Now, I have no idea what they were seeing. I'm pretty sure it wasn't a vehicle leaving the body, but they believed it, so they saw it. So we have to take that as just factual as far as Neoplatonists are concerned. So you do the rites, Now, oh, why does it rise? Well, remember now it's ethereal, so it's light, and it's also lit up, if you will. And you'll remember that the gods cannot descend here. So how do they get from the body to the gods, ether to ether? Well, the gods can do one really cool thing. Okay, that is, they can shine their light, they can illuminate. And what is the light of a planet? The light of a planet is ether. It's an ethereal ray, because that's what they're made of. That's what their bodies are, right? So this ethereal ray they can send down, and this can do all sorts of magical things. I don't have anyone around me. If I had an herb, I put an herb up in my hand right now, okay? And say, this is a magical herb. And so, why is that? That's just a piece of matter that happens to grow in the earth. Why is that magical? Well, because at some point, the planetary gods, shone their ethereal light down on that plant and made it special. And that now can be used as a holy item in the Theurgy that we're performing to help the soul be released from the body and get back to the gods. And once you got that going, and our soul is ready to go, the gods' ethereal light can match up with the ethereal vehicle and cause it to rise. The gods never have to leave their planetary sphere. They don't do that, but they can make that appear. Now, Theurgy, backing up a little bit. Theurgy is a gradual process. You don't just go, I think I'll go meet the gods today. So you get ready, you purify your body, you purify your soul through various rituals and things like that. And so your vehicle is then purified and ready to be adapted to the gods. You might start with some of the lower, what he calls superior classes of being. So you might start with a purified soul. You might start with a daemon. You might start with a hero. And these are all divinities of sorts, but not gods, that can travel up and down. For Iamblichus, heroes and demons could travel up and down. Remember, because in Plato's Symposium, that was their job, to travel and bring things back and forth. So they can actually come down and help get the soul organized and help get the spherical vehicle traveling upwards. Later on, as you get better at this, the god can just do it on his own, shining its light on you and bringing you up. So the ritual progresses over time. You get better and better at it. You become purer and more pure as you move on. And so the first step, so now that we've gotten here, the first step was we finally separated our soul in this Theurgic rite, whatever it is. We've used special objects to get us started. We've called on the intermediary daimons and heroes to help us ascend. We've gotten the gods to shine their light on them. So we finally come up and we connect vehicle to vehicle with the gods. Now we got to imagine the gods having this separate existence, but also being sort of 7 planetary bodies that are in tune with one another and are all one God under the heading of 7 gods. So when we attach to them, we attach to our own leader god. Let's just say ours is Jupiter because we're all philosophers here. So we've attached to Jupiter, but that also attaches us to all the other gods and, of course, to the stars. So now our vehicle can maneuver in the solar system or geocentric system anywhere it wants to go. And what we're trying to do next, right, is to get in place with the star gods, which are on the outermost sphere of reality as we know it. So we park there in the same way as in the Phaedrus myth, the gods park there. So we're now an ethereal vehicle parked on the edge of the universe, as it were, looking up into the intelligible realm where the forms are. And it is through that process that we finally can, right, without how is not exactly clear, but as our vehicle is stuck there with the gods of the stars, with the bodies of the stars, our immaterial rational soul can observe, in some metaphorical sense, the forms and the intelligible objects that are in the intelligible realm. And that brings us closer to the reality that we want. That takes us out of time, into eternity, out of thinking thought by thought by thought, to understanding everything all at once. And that's like the highest thing you want to do, except for eventually you want to get all the way up to the one itself, where you're not a thinker thinking thought anymore. You're not one object out of time, seeing it all, you're part of the whole. It's complete unification, and you've made your highest object. Iamblichus says that happens to a very, very, very few of us very late in life. I'm 73 now. I hope I'm getting close. But that's how the ritual works. And then it brings you back down again. And in stuff I'm working on right now, I'm arguing, and I'm seeing that other people have argued too, that by coming back down, remembering the cave story of Plato, we're coming back to help everybody else down here too. So we have this now brotherhood of man kind of thing going on, where we're going to come back, help make people better, and make the universe a better place for all of us. But it all comes from that higher knowledge we are capable of only because we know how to do theurgy. That's my overview of theurgy.
Thank you. I have one final question for you, and then we'll open it up to more questions. Just more detail on the Ascent ritual. So in section 2, you talk about the Ascent ritual and the replacement of the images. So the Theurgist will use some magical objects, but also potentially images, and then through the divine illumination, the objects or images are replaced. Can you elaborate on this process? Whether it's related to the forms, and then finally your thoughts on these sort of practices in Renaissance magic.
Okay. Now, I'm going to talk about the ritual as a way of separating the soul from the body and getting ourselves back up to the one, if possible, but certainly to the intelligible, where we can do the kind of thinking we can't possibly do down here. We get an understanding we couldn't have. Another reason for doing them is the basic one of, divination. What's the future to hold? What kind of things should I do? And it evidently has something to do with this too. And for me, this is really difficult. I mean, I can understand the Ascent ritual and making myself one with the cosmos and all of that. But once I've got that, why do I want to know, who's going to win the basketball tournament in March? This makes no sense to me, but that can't be what they were up to. But they were trying to get some sort of messages from the gods to know something about the future that was important, whatever that might have been, that was important enough to use a Theurgic ritual to do. Now, to do that, we're not so much separating our souls from our bodies anymore, though it might involve that as well, as trying to get our ethereal vehicles to pick up the messages from the gods that the daemons are bringing to us. And so what we've got now, this has to take me back to Aristotle, but I won't go through all of this because that'll drive you crazy. But one of the things that the vehicle of the soul does is acts as the seat of imagination. And imagination is imagined as having images in it. So when we think of, okay, let me tell you a little bit of Aristotle. When we see things, we see like, what is it to be a house? So we see a house here, we see a house there, we see several houses. And that gives us an idea, right, of what the house is. That's Plato too. Where was I going with that? See what happens? I need a theurgic ritual to remember things sometimes. So I'm trying now to get an explanation for divination. So I'm going, okay, I've got images of things in my fantasia, in my vehicle. Now I want a different message. I don't want the ones I've gotten from looking at different houses to what a house is. And I want something from the gods to tell me something that's really important about the future that's going to save all mankind from something or something like that. So I've got to get that image. How do I do it? Well, that image has to come in our ethereal vehicle. It has to be brought in, right, through the illumination of the gods or daemons or whoever's going to bring the message. So part of the ritual then in that case is not me separating myself from my body to go up to get knowledge my own, but me sitting in, or let me do it with a theurgic priest. The theurgic priest having a victim, often a young child, by the way, because there's less interference in their mind. So it makes it easier. And puts the child in a trance somehow or another. And images are put in it. And the child probably babbles something that the theurgist then can explain. What he was actually saying was, that kind of thing. And that'll give you the information that you needed to foretell the future in some way or another. I assume it's not an exact thing like, you watch this group play basketball, this is going to happen in the third quarter. Not something like that. but it's something more like, what is the trend in humanity that has to take place to make the change that we want to see take place? Something like that, I would imagine, but that's just my guess. But somehow or another, through that ritual, the boys, if there is a boy, the boy's vehicle gets the image. It can be interpreted by the theurgist who's standing over him, and the theurgist can tell us what the practical application is, what we should be doing with our lives to make the place better. The whole period later, when we get to the Renaissance, is absolutely incredible. Sometime after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, right, we lost track of Greek. We were no longer able to read and translate it. So when you read people like Thomas Aquinas, he didn't have Greek. All he read about Plato and Aristotle or what he had in other Latin writings. St. Augustine was really important for this, and so were other writers that were translated into Latin. So in the Renaissance, they got the original text again, and people started learning how to read Greek. And they came across Plato, and they ran across Plato at the same time as they ran across the Neoplatonists. And that put that tie really close together in a single bond, that this was the way you read Plato. And the interpretations of Plato consistently became Neoplatonic interpretations up until the end of the 20th century. And I'd argue beyond that, actually. We're not free of that influence, nor should we be. So when they started reading these texts in the Renaissance, you get people, and especially in the Italian Renaissance, that were just going to town with it. Look at this, and they built their own Neoplatonic structures, using as and adapting the Neoplatonic ones from Iamblichus, from Proclus, from Damascus, and using that to interpret their own Christianity. So that became part of the process historically in that way. And that, of course, then changes everything that took place, everything all along the way to the Enlightenment and beyond. We've never lost Platonism. Okay, Megan, you can.
Thank you so
If anybody
much.
has anything.
Yeah, we have one question in the chat. Why does one who returns from illumination to cave get killed?
Excuse me, decay and get killed?
When they return to the cave, why do they from the illumination, why do they get killed?
Why do they get killed? Do they? Oh, you mean that everybody gets upset with them and thinks they're crazy? Is that it? Because when you come back from the cave, you just come back and try to teach people. They don't want to listen to you. You're a philosopher and nutty person. We still think that. And but still, it's your duty to try to train them the best you can, which is why in the Republic he's trying to build the ideal state, so that when the people come back, they will be the people in charge. They'll be the rulers, and they'll do their thing, and then get time off to do philosophy, and then come back again, etc. Is that the point of the question? Am I getting it right, or am I just screwing everything up?
Who wrote the question? Do you want to elaborate?
I didn't write the question, but let me make a suggestion. In Republic
Yes.
Book 7, where the cave allegory, whatever it is presented, at the end it said that the person who's had this vision of the sun is going to go back and they're going to get angry at him and kill him. Seems to be a reference to the life of Socrates.
Well, that could be.
In his life, the Athenian people turned on him and executed him for corrupting youth, for what he was doing. It doesn't, whether this is something a Platonist should do, Alan Bloom, in his very popular translation, says this is the worst thing in Plato. We should never go back to the cave. In fact, the whole point of the Straussian movement is to educate people in colleges to how to save our world. Because if you go out into the general world of America and Europe, they'll kill you.
Yeah, there is that point in the Republic too where Plato says that if they could get their hands on you, if you're or you're a philosopher, they're going to think you're crazy and they might put you to death and all that. So yeah, that might be what's going on there. Obviously, Plato thought that it was another stream to that story, that was one possible outcome, but there were other possible outcomes as well, including his in the Republic, that you would actually form a society that would better mankind rather than make it worse. So I think he has an answer to it, at least. And as far as the Neoplatonists concerned, since their cave thing is quite different, right? That is, they're doing their ritual ascent, learning what to do, and then bringing it back again. They knew, right? Because they weren't in charge anymore. The Christians were in charge of the empire while this was going on. They knew that they couldn't change the whole system, but they would work within it to build their own kind of communities, right? To make a better world. And they also, I have to say, especially in Alexandria, tried to work ways where the two systems could work side by side together. They weren't successful, obviously, but it was an idea. So yeah, there's a lot going on with that idea about the danger of coming back.
Yeah. Next question. Can you recommend a book or article that investigates in detail how many followers, believers in Neoplatonism there were at different times? When reading Proclus, Iamblichus, etc., my first question is, how many other people ever accepted this and believed it? Thousands, dozens, less than a dozen?
That's a good question. You might look into some of the writings of Edward Watts, Watts. He does a lot of good stuff about what might have been going on in the schools, what their interaction, the pagans with the Christians was like, how philosophers dealt with non-philosophers. I don't remember anything in there about specific numbers, but you know, you at least get an idea that there were several of them out there. The two major schools, one was in Athens until Justinian closed it in 529, and the other was in Alexandria, and it kept on going for a while, much longer. And especially in Alexandria, they taught both Christian and pagan philosophers within the school. And you'd have teachers that were of both sorts as well. So I got a feeling that was a pretty big school. But again, 100, 200, that might be about it. We know that there are other people in the empire living elsewhere that wrote on this. Not all of them were involved in the schools themselves. So it must have been other people that did this. And pre-Neoplatonism, in the Middle Platonic period, you have people like Apuleius that would be orators as well and go town to town and give speeches about Plato and about Platonism and justice and all these sorts of things, and actually draw crowds. They come to this. They were the rock stars of their time. And so you'd reach people that way as well. And there's one more thing I was going to say. Oh, there are also non-philosophical writers that were interested in ancient religion that would go to places like the Apollo's oracles and things like that, and write up about those. So you get stories about the basic Neoplatonic texts explaining how God's related to us without being philosophical texts. They're more practical. So you have a lot of people doing that. And again, we're only talking about the educated classes, the ones that knew how to read, the one that had money to travel around. So you're talking maybe 10% or less of the whole population anyway. Probably much less. But
Thank
that's the
you.
best I can do.
Edward Watts. Okay, next question is, could you talk about the role? Oh no, I'm sorry, going back one question before that. Brian is asking, what is the relationship between the intermediary beings, angels, demons, etc., and the emanations?
Right. First of all, there's a hierarchy of superior classes of being. So the angels are at the top, the daemons are under them, the heroes are under them, and in the Iamblichus, at least, the purified souls are under those. For Iamblichus, not for the later Platonists after him, but for Iamblichus, only daimons and heroes, and to some extent must be the case, the purified souls, can wander down to earth and help us out down here. Angels did not. In Proclus and beyond, none of them did, if I understand them correctly. So that became a problem, sort of working that out. So there's a kind of difference. In books 1 and 2 of the De Mysteriis that Iamblichus wrote, he tries to differentiate amongst all four kinds, and a few others too, of those superior classes, talking like angels do this while daimons do this, within the same rite or same procedure. So if you're talking about, I don't know, bringing a message down about something important. You say, well, the angels do this around the gods, but the daemons do this as they come down, and then heroes would take it a little further and do this. So there's a kind of differentiation that he maps out. It's never been all that clear to me. I don't think it's all that clear to anybody. But if you want to take a look at Greg Shaw, SHAW's, Greg Shaw's got a book on Theurgy and Iamblichus. And if you just look up in the back on demons or angels, or something, you can get an idea of the differentiations that he sees there as well. But they're all differentiated from one another. But again, they act as a unit the same way that the planets do.
Thank you. Catherine is asking, could you talk about the role of Orpheus in Neoplatonism and perhaps recommend some further reading on Neoplatonic Orpheus, please?
Orpheus. Yes, he does show up every now and then. You have to remember that for the Neoplatonists, myths have hidden meanings that are very important philosophically, and that you have to know how to read them properly. So when you hear a story about Orpheus being torn limb from limb, for example, that's not literally true, but it points to something that is true. And that's sort of breaking apart that dispersal that could happen if you are a human being and you're not doing your philosophy correctly, right? You can lose yourself to the world, and you don't want that to happen. So with any myth, they can do this. Now, is it a big thing they do with Orpheus? I'm hate to do this, but I'm actually drawing a blank on anything that they say specifically about Orpheus in their texts. And I know there's got to be something that I'm forgetting, because they are not going to miss something as exciting as that.
Oh, please don't worry. I'm just sort of interested in it because I like the importance of Neoplatonism to artists.
Mm-hmm.
And they've used it a lot, haven't they? And because Orpheus is a creator, that it's a niche interest, and it's got nothing to do with the Ascent ritual. So
Yep.
I beg your pardon. Thank you.
No, really to do. It's an interesting question, and it does take us to that larger question about myth and how it's used in philosophy. Because, you really want to be able to say something specific about all of this. So they thought even Homer, right, was divinely inspired. So you just got to read him properly to get the right information out of him. Yeah, I can't think of anything on Orpheus, darn it. And I'm sorry about that. Probably like 10 seconds after we sign off, I'll go, oh, that.
Thank you. We've got another question. What were the early Christian views on the Theurgic practices from from Isabella?
Well, you will not be surprised to hear that they hated the whole concept. They were sure that all that was going on there was that evil demons, because all demons in Christianity are evil, you'll remember, evil demons were drawing them off and making them do terrible things and giving them misinformation that was going to ruin the world. We have some really wonderful tracts from Christian writers. Just tearing the pieces of those demons are doing that. So, and actually, you can do that with televangelists today. They do something similar, so you get an idea of what early Christianity was like vis-a-vis pagans that way. Okay.
Next question from Angelo. Can the soul in Christianity be traced to Plato, to Aristotle, to Alexander the Great, to the Pharisees of Christ?
Well, certainly the influence is there, right? I mean, the whole concept of the soul was developed in the pagan tradition early on. You can see a little bit of it in the pre-Socratics, where they talk about soul. Heraclitus thinks that, and then others think other things about it. Okay, so it comes that way, but it's Plato that starts putting together a real religious text, pagan religious text about it, talking about an afterlife, punishment for being wrong in this life, reward for doing good in this life. All that's in Plato already. Aristotle's a little different, but he's playing around with the concept of soul. So and there's a part of it as with Plato, that's immortal and a part of it that's not. And the immortal part is the rational soul, and they both thought that. They had a different view of what the afterlife might be, clearly, but they had a view of an afterlife. And so I think that, since Christianity is coming into its own at that period, is taking those ideas and developing them in their own way and coming up with their own concept of soul. So I think the two are completely related to one another. Absolutely. They could not be.
We've got a question from Rowan. Rowan says, in talking about how we need the demons because the gods don't come down to us, you mentioned that if the moon came down to us, we'd all be in trouble. Could you elaborate, please? I think Ed talked a bit about it.
First, you should go watch the day the Earth stood still. You'll find all about that. But seriously, the problem here is within Platonism itself. The gods are aloof, they're separate, they're different from us. We don't, we as human beings that are embodied are sort of dirty. We can't get ourselves in contact with the gods that way. We've got to cleanse ourselves before we can do it. And so the gods never descend. Now you can imagine the problem this caused, since we were talking about Christianity, early Christianity. Imagine the problems this caused for them. And if the last pagan emperor was Julian, and Julian only lasted 3 years, but he had this project to rebuild the Roman Empire's sort of religiosity in a Neoplatonic way. He read Iamblichus. He had people on his staff that knew about Neoplatonism and gave him advice. So the Christians' thing is that God came down on earth. And of course, they could not accept this. They said, no, Plato said in the Symposium, God does not come down to earth. It doesn't work that way. So you've got it wrong. And the Christians got angry at them and said, no, you've got it wrong. So when they want to explain when the gods are on earth, and they do want to do that, they do it through heroes or people like that can come down to earth, can be present, and can interact with us. So, names again. As you get older, you'll find out if you want to reach for a name, it's not going to be there. And it's happening right now. But Julian had an intermediary god that one that was a hero that could come down, and it's the one that does all the medicine. I'm forgetting his name right now. Anybody have any help on a doctor? Came down, taught. He's in Homer as teaching medicine, bringing it down. He's sometimes talked about as a god, but then he was a hero for the Neoplatonists.
Is that Asclepius?
Asclepius, thank you. So that became an intermediary god that did more good than Christ ever did, he says. So there's this, like, you want an intermediary, you got to think you got a god, you don't have one, give it up. So that kind of influence that goes on. So that, going back to the point of the question, there was a real seriousness to this for the Neoplatonists. You don't mingle with gods down here, you mingle with gods up there, and only after you've purified yourself. Plato's absolutely right about that, they said. So you can't have anything else, and so the gods can't come down. And in my funny statement, the moon can't come down because it would blow us up. I do love old 1950s science fiction movies. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, great, thanks. That's really what I was hoping for.
It looks like we have one final question from Christian. Christian is asking, are the writings of Dionysius the Areopagite an attempt to Christianize the Neoplatonic idea of the daemons?
Yes, that's an easy one to answer. It is an attempt to bring Neoplatonism into the Christian system. And, it had a lot of people following it too, so it didn't just die away. And I would imagine that if you looked, even in the 19th century, you would find some people that still believe that. Definitely.
Part of the liturgy of a number of Christian groups, including Catholics and Lutherans, include a prayer that includes reference to the angels and archangels and all the company of heaven.
Mhm.
So it's still a part of Christian liturgy to refer to that, although it doesn't appear in sermons, no one talks about it, but it's still there. It's in the liturgy. It survives as something that probably goes back to the ancient world.
Yeah, I could believe that. I could believe they're not going to talk about it in sermons too.
It's just,
I guess we have time for, we have a few more questions happening in the chat.
Yeah.
A question about, can you speak to Hypatia and her relationship to this topic?
Yeah, Hypatia was, of course, a mathematician, but also a Platonic philosopher who taught philosophy. And we have some correspondence between her and one of her students, Synesius. So we actually can read some stuff that they were, at least from his point of view, from his angle, they were discussing with each other that had to do with Neoplatonic topics. So she's a real thing. And there's a lot of myth around her, of course. And again, we can talk about movies, the more recent one on Hypatia, not all of which should be believed as literal fact. But it does show her as a teacher interacting with students. And of course, in Alexandria, getting on the wrong side of the Christians for what she was teaching and being torn apart by a mob. By the way, I was in Alexandria giving a paper about 2 years ago, and they took me to the park, which is there now, which is they claim is where she was torn apart. So it's now a park. I thought you'd appreciate knowing that. I think that was a good thing. They don't call it Hypatia Park, darn it, but they should.
Do we have time for 2 more questions, and then let's not ask any more. So this is a big question. What effect did Plato and Aristotle have on Christianity? That's from Angelo.
Enormous, especially Aristotle in the Western tradition. Like you got Aquinas using Aristotle to explain the rationality of God and why we have to do what we have to do. I think that all these religious writings, whether they're pagan or Christian or Muslim or Jewish or anything else in the Eastern tradition elsewhere, right, are human beings trying to find a way to understand our place in the system that we're living in. Why are we here? What are we supposed to do? And this is universal. And every once in a while, you come across people like Plato and Aristotle that really give you a focus for that, to give you a way to think about it. And starting with them, maybe thinking about it in new ways, building upon them. And this is what's great about this whole tradition. This is what makes, I think, Neoplatonism and Platonism generally just so important, because it started small. Plato, an academy, a few rich folk that afforded to send their children there to learn about government and justice and things like that. And through writings and through Aristotle's Lyceum and then onwards, it grew. And through that growth, they come back to these all eternal questions that you find everywhere, wherever you go on Earth. And eventually find some people on planets elsewhere, they'll probably be wondering the same sorts of things. And Plato and Aristotle are a darn good start for this. They lay out a whole lot of possibilities. There are things you're going to go, this strikes me as right. I really appreciate him saying this. And the things that are like, this has just got to be wrong. These guys are crazy. And that's going to make you think, build, change, renew. And so this is an excellent start. This is a place where all of us can go, read, develop our ideas, and move forward with them. So I think that Plato and Aristotle are damn important. And by the way, so are all of us.
From Joseph, is there any part of the Joseph is asking about ethics? Is there any part of the ritual that speaks to ethics or behavior? Like, if the goal to achieve unity with the one, is that just a mental and or religious spiritual effort, or how do the Neoplatonists suggest we act vaguely, virtuously?
Well, they didn't believe it was virtuous, and they thought that different levels of the ascent would get you into different levels of virtue, if that makes sense. This is partly Plato's fault too. If you remember the Republic for a bit, he talks about the four main virtues: justice and wisdom and temperance and whatever the fourth one was. What am I leaving out? It's not holiness, because you let that one drop out. Moderation, justice, wisdom. How could I forget that? Which is the most important of all. And this is sort of shown as, we want to make ourselves be able to use that to be just to one another in a society on earth. So the Neoplatonists adopted that and said, oh, okay, that's one kind of set of virtues. There's civic virtue, and we should have that earliest stage. But as we carry on with the Ascent, we want to purify our souls. So there must be purificatory virtues. And they found them in the Phaedo of Plato. So you've got the same virtues, but now you're at a higher level. You're purifying yourself so you can meet intellect and engage in election. So the next stage is in elections. You've got intellectual virtue. Then you've got the higher realms where you're dealing with the gods, the intelligible gods, and eventually the one. And those are theurgic virtues, are the highest virtues you can have. There's this whole system of virtues that are tied to the Ascent ritual. So as you do your Ascent ritual, purify yourself, you move up the chain, the ladder to the highest realms. Then you descend again to the cave. So when you come back down, you may not be doing intellectual thinking, not being intelligibly anymore. You're within time. It's got to be different. But you've learned something that you can adapt and use down here to make the world a better place. So I think that's the relationship. So yes, Theurgy does have to do with virtue and making us more virtuous people and better people, at the same time as it's a very personal thing where you're making yourself more attuned to the gods and eventually at one with the one. So it's personal and it's also interpersonal. That was a good question. I like thinking about that. It's part of a paper I'm writing now. So I mean, having said that, I might look at the tape of this and steal it for myself. Quote myself. I like that.
John, do you have time for one or two more questions?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. From Julia, could you say something about more about receptivity, special non-human beings that embody divine purpose in some way?
Receptivity. Let me take that one way and see if that's the right way to take it. Remember I talked about those plants that get illuminated by the gods and they become special? Okay, so in order for us to partake in any kind of ritual that they're talking about, we have to be receptive to the ritual, right? So how do you do that? And that has to do with preparing yourself for the ritual itself. Now that purification I was talking about. You come there and then they say, I want to be part of this, and you study and you do what you have to do, but you also have to purify your vehicle so that it's nothing but ether, not stained ether in any way, so that it'll be adaptive and receptive to the gods. So in a way, our vehicle is like a radio, and the gods are like radio waves. The radio waves are always out there. They're always coming at us, but we have to be receptive to pick them up. So we have to have our radios tuned to the right station. So that we'll pick up those images and other things that they're trying to send to our vehicle, so we'll know what the right thing to do is. So the receptivity is part of the theurgic process. We come wanting to be, first of all, part of the process, and then we've got to adapt ourselves to it and purify our vehicle so that we can receive the signals from the gods. That allows us, remember, to ascend, to be with them, and to understand better, sort of hands-on without having any hands knowledge. Does that answer the receptive question, do you think, or was there something else beyond that?
I think I phrased it badly. I was thinking more what you said about particular animals or plants or objects being somehow specially in tune with the idea of the gods so that they become something that can be used in divination, that there's something in the non-human thing itself which makes it special.
Exactly. Let me take a different kind of rite. I think explains it even better. One of the things the Neoplatonists like to do was enliven statues. So you've got just a statue, but it's going to do something. It's going to move or even speak to you, right? those things usually start with having a special herb of some sort or another. That would be
Right.
one that they would say was illuminated by the gods that would bring to life a lifeless object. So one use for them would be in a theurgic rite would be to do that. So you can like astound your friends or something like that,
Mm.
but also learn things as you're doing it. So that would be the point of it. But within the ritual itself, it might be that you as a first-time theurgic person, when you're just trying to get started and maybe your vehicle isn't pure enough yet, these would help you in your purification process. You could bring that with you to the ritual and sort of offer it as a helpful assistant in your ascent.
Right.
So I think those are literally hands-on helps to get you to where you want to be.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, it looks like we have one final question this time. Final Lee. John Nolan is asking, in your opinion, was Plato or Socrates actually attempting to lay down a system of dogmas or beliefs, or were the dialogues just exercises in reasoning and not intended to be dogmatic?
That's like a universal question that's kept us going for centuries, isn't it? Okay, I'll give you my take on it. And I'm not in a majority opinion on this one about Plato. I think Plato was constantly philosophizing. He was never completely sure he got the right answer, but he was always working around the sides. He was pretty sure the forms were there. I don't think he ever gave them up in our knowledge of the forms and that sort of thing. But you'll see him testing ideas out in different dialogues. If you look at my area of interest in philosophy is the soul itself. And so in the Phaedo, the soul is a single solitary thing, and it's at war with the body. And so our bodies want to do certain things. They get hungry, they take us away from reading texts so we can't study, that kind of thing. And it's very simple. The soul is good, the body's bad. A few years later, he comes to the Republic. And he says, well, wait a minute. The soul seems to be at war with itself sometimes. So I think the soul is tripartite. It's partly rational, partly irrational, and partly kind of spirited and angry and that kind of thing. So there's three parts, and they're always at war with each other, not at war with the body, but you'll see those parts fighting. Then he comes to Timaeus. Oh, I forgot. And he says that all of that, all three parts, are everlasting. They're immortal. And he says that again in the Phaedrus when he has the myth with disunited, right, by a soul all in the heavens with three parts, two horses and a chariot. Then he comes to the Timaeus and he says, well, you know, there are three parts to the soul, but two parts, that spirited part and the irrational part, are mortal. They die. And the immortal part, that's the reason, the rational soul, and it goes on forever. So just with the soul and four different dialogues, it's four different dialogues, but three different views of the soul, I think. He seems to be changing his mind. And I think he does that with other parts of his philosophy as well. And that's not surprising to me. I mean, I don't think now the same kind of concepts that I thought were true now are true when I was 20. I've changed my mind a lot over the years. It's just what we do. Plato should not be any different than that. And it looks from the text to me that he's not. He's experimenting, he's playing, he's got definite dogma, right, of some things that never change. The soul is immortal, whatever the soul may be, right? And it's, you know, it's better to be wise than to not be wise and all those kinds of things that he says. But he can change around the edges, experiment, see how that works. And he'll write those in the dialogue, I think in the hopes of having other feedback come to him. Say, well, let me think about this a little bit. And he can do that within the academy, but that gives him a wider audience outside of the academy that'll be writing to him or at least responding to him in some sense. So I think that Plato, partly dogmatic, but mainly like all philosophers, searching, looking, and knowing that he might have to change his mind along the way. That is not the majority opinion. Majority opinion is he made up his mind, and all these things say the same thing, but I just don't see it myself. So two ways of looking at Plato and Aristotle. God, I like that question. That was a good one.
Well, thank you so much for your time, John Finamore, and for sharing your breadth of knowledge with us today. And thanks everyone for coming and asking questions.
Yes, thank you all. You're a great audience. I appreciate it.